Kia ora koutou, nā mai haere mai, and welcome to our panel, which we've called Insert Link, Connecting Digital Humanities and Digital Literature in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm David Ciccoricco speaking to you from Otepoti, Dunedin at the University of Otago. I'll be your host for this session and the third speaker. First of all, I want to do a big thanks to the organizers of this event, Paul and his team, and especially the team behind the scenes who have been handling all of the tech and logistics. We also want to acknowledge and pay respects to the prior inhabitants of this land. And I personally wish to convey gratitude to Taukaea Whenua and subsequent Pākehā who have allowed me to make this place my home, and I will continue to act as its guardian. So in recent years, the international trend has been emerging or coming together of the field of digital humanities and that of digital, or what's also called electronic literature at the institutional level. In one sense, we are yet to witness this convergence in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Yet in another sense, the two fields were never really separate to begin with. That is, there was simply not enough critical mass to sustain either of the two domains in isolation. And given New Zealand's relatively small size, digital literature inevitably overlapped with digital humanities. Let me just give one quick example of that. Way back in 2005, Brian Opie, who is at Wellington, had a vision for a New Zealand Council for Humanities. He, as part of that inaugural event, he put together a panel on digital humanities. He saw what was coming and what was in the works. And on that panel, he included a traditional DH infrastructure scholar. He invited someone from the States alongside an emerging scholar of digital literature. So they're all part of the same notion, they're all part of the same vision from the start in this sense. But even if DH in NZ has started to indulge its creative side, a significant disconnect still remains between academic proponents of digital humanities and those artistic and educational communities who might have much to gain from its technical and intellectual infrastructures. So this panel explores the theme of creating communities in the sense of communities that create, and it aspires to connect some of the historical, pedagogical, and artistic nodes in a network that coalesces around this arguably transient entity known as the digital humanities. We want to think of perhaps some of the distinctive contributions that New Zealand might make to this disciplinary synergy along the way. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, April Salchert. April did her MA at University of Uppsala in Sweden and did an outrageously good PhD dissertation at the University of Otago on empathy and empathy games. And today she's going to be discussing the ethical challenges that arise when video games engage with the politics of marginalized identity representation. Her paper is titled Learning the Power of Narratives in Digital Media. Please welcome April.
Oh, thank you, Dave, for that very nice introduction. So I'm just going to share my screen here real quick because I have slides. And here we go. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about narratives in digital media, as Dave said, and why we should consider teaching narratives in digital media in schools similar to how we teach literature. So, of course, we already have digital media in our schools, in our classrooms. The curriculums now include learning areas that range from computational thinking to digital content design And alongside of that, we've seen online platforms and games and all sorts of online tools that support these learning areas. For instance, Code Combat is really cool. I highly suggest checking it out. Is a game that teaches you how to play. So you're playing a game and learning to code at the same time. Gamefruit is another great example of an online platform that teaches you how to make games, animations, interactive fictions, or digital narratives. And so these are sorts of things that you can find and online that supports that computational thinking and digital content design learning areas. But digital media and digital tools and online platforms also support other subjects such as geography, math, science, and literacy. For instance, there's a great example that just came out recently, Katuku Island, which is a mobile gaming app that has literacy exercises and decision-making challenges in them, but it centers Maori culture front and center in the game. So players are creating Maori warrior-inspired avatars and designing weapons and building tribes, all while also doing things like literacy exercises. And games like Katuku Island are exciting to see. And it's similar to the games that I researched for my doctoral research that Dave was said in the introduction. I was looking at games that represented marginalized communities, such as Bury Me My Love, which is also a mobile gaming app that follows the story of Noor, who is a Syrian woman making her way into Europe. And Hellblade, which main character is living with psychosis. So these games and others like them have been celebrated not only for their representation, but for their potential to garner empathy for the marginalized groups the characters represent, which is why these games are sometimes referred to as empathy games. So, but if we're going to be using games to teach about cultures, identities, and experiences, particularly from the perspectives of marginalized others and those experience being marginalized, and these kinds of representations are not without risks, and therefore it's important to think about the ethical implications of these representation, which is why that was the center to my doctoral research. Looking at how players may confuse the experience of playing a game like Bury Me My Love or Hellblade as equal as understanding or knowing the experience of the migrant other or the other living with psychosis. So my question in my doctoral research was, is there something that digital media brings to the table to address this ethical challenge? And in short, to sum up few years of research, is that I found that yes, indeed, there is something that digital media brings to the table, although with a little bit of an asterisk to it, which I'll talk about in a second. So what I found is that narratives in digital media has a kind of a disruptive design in these particular games that get the player to think about the representation of otherness within the game. So in a way, the game disrupts the player's experience with the game to encourage them to reflect on the otherness represented in the game. Again, this isn't a perfect solution, but I'll give you an example here by talking to what I found with Hellblade. So Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice, follows the story of Senua, who is a picked warrior who is journeying into the Viking underworld of Helheim to save her partner Dillion's soul, who had been killed in a Viking raid. What complicates Senua's journey is that she also is living with psychosis, so she is experiencing visual and auditory hallucinations. So there's two versions of this game. There is a console version, a regular console version, and then there's a VR version. For my dissertation, I looked at the VR version. Both versions are highly recommended by me, but the VR version really, the intensity is chalked up just a little bit more because so for one, the way the game is designed is that the audio was recorded in such a way that you are hearing all the voices that Senua hears. And some of the voices sound like a whisper right in your ear, really far away. There's a lot of voices. They all have their kind of own little characters. But then in the VR game, you're also feel like you're in the world. So the player is given a sense of embodiment in which they are inside the virtual world and inside Senua's mind. And this is a very, very cool effect, but it also comes with some ethical problems because people might walk away thinking they understand what it's like to live with psychosis because they played Hellblade. They may forget that there's a difference between what it's like to actually live with psychosis and what the game is representing. So, but there were certain aspects of Hellblade's design that disrupted this embodiment and did remind the player that they are not Senua. So one of the things I observed was that did this disruption was the change in perspective. There are a few cutscenes that where Senua in fact turns and talks directly to the player, and this is quite abrupt because most of the game you're third person view walking and controlling Senua from behind, and you're hearing everything in her head. But in these moments, that's completely broken, and Senua is talking directly at you as another character, really kind of separating the player from Senua in that moment. Another thing is the narrator's voice. It's a voice meant for the player only. So there are a lot of voices in this game, but one voice is meant specifically for the player and says so at the beginning of the game. Talks about how this voice is going to stay close to you and not alert the other voices. And this voice gives you a little backstory about Senua or a little context about where you are in the game. And whereas the other voices, when they're speaking, talk to the player as if they are Senua, this voice talks to the player as a separate other person. So another thing that pulls the player out away from Senua. And then there's also the moments in the game where the player has a sense of needing to escape. So this game was not meant to be fun. The developers specifically said that they didn't want to make this game to be fun. It's a stressful game, it's an intense game, but it's highly rewarding if you get to the end of it. But the player's ability to escape or take their headphones off or pause the game is really critical here, because there were quite a few moments when I was playing the game where there's a big challenge, whether it was a boss fight or a maze or some sort of puzzle that was really difficult to figure out. During these moments, the voices become really intense and difficult to kind of tone out while trying to figure things out. So one way you can do this is by turning down the volume or removing your headphones or pausing the game and taking a break. But obviously in doing this, it almost feels like cheating, because you are taking yourself, now you're a player trying to just get through a moment in the game and not in fact, because Senua doesn't have that option. Obviously she cannot turn off her voices or take her voices off or pause the hallucinations she's experiencing. So moments like these really kind of give the player opportunities to reflect on the fact that they are not, there's certain aspects, there's certain parts of Senua's experience that they don't have access to. And that even if they're playing a game, like the fact that they even can take off their headphones, to know that, well, I know that people who are living with psychosis can't do that. So there's certain pieces that are just not accessible to the player in terms of that particular experience. So I recognized quite a few of these disruptive designs in the 4 games I looked at in my doctoral research. But there was one thing that kind of kept coming back. So while these were all great, and I'm very proud of finding them, there was one comment from my partner, in fact, when I had him play a few of the games. And one thing he said was, gee, this is great, but I would have never known that Hellblade was about psychosis or that any of these moments were significant if you hadn't told me. And this bothered me, especially because there's a big warning label at the beginning of the game that says this game contains representation of psychosis. So, and I pointed that out, but apparently people don't read warning labels anymore. And I can't really blame him. I know that I might have missed this as well. So I thought about that and reflected on that as I was drawing up the conclusion for my research. And I also went on Twitch. So I don't know how many people are familiar with Twitch, but Twitch is a streaming service, game streaming service, or a streaming service where you can go on and play video games and stream them live, and people can watch you. And there's a chat, so you can talk to the person playing the game and have like an interactive conversation while people are playing. So I went and watched people play Hellblade, and I found that my partner's comment was supported by these people playing the game. Is that there was people, even the streamers themselves, didn't realize that Hellblade was about psychosis, and that was very frustrating because I thought that that was rather obvious, but clearly it wasn't. Some players seem to mistake Senua's voices and hallucinations as magic, which is fair to, I mean, if you play a lot of video games, a lot of main characters tend to have some sort of power or magical ability. And even in Hellblade, there are moments when other characters refer to Senua's hallucinations as a kind of power. So couldn't really fault people for coming to that conclusion. And then also the player might not identify the disruptions I talked about as necessarily unusual for a video game. Cutscenes are very, very, very common, especially ones that, you have characters talking directly to the camera. That's not uncommon. It's not uncommon for players to take a break during situations that they can't get through a particular point in a game. There's narrator voices. These are not uncommon aspects of the game. So, or some might just become frustrated and quit, even if they know it's about psychosis. Some people get really stressed out because this isn't a fun game. So all those opportunities to reflect on the representation are completely lost. So I was rather sad to see that and to observe that. But as I was writing my conclusion, I also reflected on the fact that there was something cool going on the Twitch streams. Is that if the streamer acknowledged that in fact this was a game about mental health, was a game about psychosis, and or I brought it up in chat, it changed the tone of the conversation in chat and with the person playing. It started to look at certain aspects of the game that made sense. And so if I mentioned, hey, this game is about psychosis, like, oh, I didn't realize this was about mental health. Oh, I see that. Oh, those voices then are hallucinations. And people started talking about it and noticing other things in the game, and even talking about their own experiences with mental health. Which brought me back to things that I was looking at out in other areas of the game. So since I was looking at representation in the game, I was also asking the question, because these games were called empathy games, of whether or not these games could in fact foster empathy for the marginalized other represented. And so I was referring to Suzanne Keene's work quite a bit, because she was asking a similar question about empathy in her work Empathy in the Novel, where she was asking whether or not novels can foster empathy. And her conclusion basically was that, well, yes, maybe, but we shouldn't shoulder novels with that kind of responsibility. And I was coming to similar conclusions, that we shouldn't shoulder video games with that kind of responsibility. So, but the other thing she noticed, which I thought was really striking, is that there were more opportunities for novels to foster empathy when readers came together to discuss novels. So she observed that when people came together, whether it was in a book club or a classroom, that there was opportunities for people to talk about things that they maybe have missed in their own reading, and reassess kind of their understanding of the novel. And if it was like an instructor bringing to light empathetic themes otherwise unnoticed. Patrick Hogan has also noticed this, stating that, sharing the experience of literature allows people to evaluate their emotional responses. So I realized that this also could apply to video games as well, and not only in terms of empathy, but in terms of representation. As I was seeing on Twitch, is that as we were talking about it, there was a realization of what that meant, and then discussions about whether or not it was ethical to have a game that was doing what it was doing, which I thought was really promising. But it was all about a shared experience of watching someone play a video game and playing these video games together and discussing people's experiences with the game itself. Which is why I suggest that we should think about how we could do this in an educational setting. In fact, Matthew Farber has mentioned a similar thing. He says treat games like books. Kids won't understand the significance of To Kill a Mockingbird just by finishing a book. Although, students might understand some themes without instruction, probably going to miss a few things. And I think the same thing could be said, or I support this particular kind of thinking, is that when we think about more kind of a formal understanding of what's going on in the video game, it supports an awareness of the ethical significance of the game's representation, because that's not going to develop in a vacuum, most likely. And in sharing experiences, it can facilitate discussions between students and teachers, talking about these ethical implications, but also considering how these digital representations impact how we view each other and our perceptions of others. And in doing this really allow games like Hellblade and Katuku Island to live up to their full potential, because I do think that these games do have a lot to offer. So in thinking about doing more kind of shared experience with video games, it provides that opportunity to get into engaging conversations and discuss these complex topics in an educational setting. So that is pretty much all I had to share today. Thank you.
And thank you, April. That was wonderful, and I think it's going to provoke a few questions and responses. It is my pleasure to introduce our second speaker of the session. Next up, we have Nat Moore, who will be talking about some of the computational methods that he applies in his own research on computational poetry. Nat did an insanely inventive master's dissertation at the University of Otago. And if that wasn't enough, he went on, decided he needed to go do a computer science degree. So that's what he's working on at the moment. His paper is titled Using Code to Decode Code, Reflexive Digital Literary Scholarship. We're going to have to do a little bit of musical chairs and text swap, but please welcome Nat. Share screen.
Kia ora, Dave, for that generous introduction, and thanks everyone for being here today. Like Dave said, my name is Nat Moore, and at the start of this year, I finished an MA in English literature at Otago. The central focus of my thesis was on how scholars of computational poetry might use classical literary critical models to think about computational poems. But I was also interested in exploring how I could use the computational methods that I was studying to inform my own analysis. And the computational poems that I were reading were collaborations between human poet programmers and programmable machines. And I wanted to see whether I could invest my thesis with the hybrid intelligence of those collaborations. In this talk, I'm going to discuss two of my attempts to think about computational poems through the act of computation. My first example relates to Nick Montfort and Stephanie Strickland's computational poem titled Sea and Spar Between, which is a leviathan of a poem that consists of over 225 trillion stanzas. The stanzas are permutations of a set of words taken from the poems of Emily Dickinson and Moby Dick by Herman Melville. The reader can navigate the poem's sea via two different methods. Firstly, the reader can move their mouse across the screen, which causes the words displayed there to flicker and change. And secondly, the reader can use a search bar to move to a particular location in the poem, because each stanza has and is locatable by two unique coordinates which Montfort and Strickland conceptualize as latitude and longitude. And I will quickly show you what the poem looks like. So we can move around by moving our mouse, and we can also type a number into the search bar at the bottom, and we are taken there at the center of the screen. The most striking interpretive challenge that Sea and Spar Between poses is, of course, its size. Stuart Moulthrop and Justin Shoemaker note that reading the entire poem would take upwards of 200 million years. The text as a whole, they write, is not just unseen, but in practical terms, unseeable. Given that so much poetry asks the reader to defer making interpretive judgments until the entire poem can be apprehended as a unit, how then does one begin to read a poem that one cannot read in its entirety? At first, I thought that one possible response to the overwhelming complexity of Sea and Spar Between at the macro level might be to try to demarcate more intelligible micro levels. In other words, I thought that one might begin reading the poem at some arbitrary stanza and interpret that stanza in relation to its local context to create a cluster of local significance, in effect treating the poem as a kind of backwards jigsaw puzzle where one starts with the completed jigsaw and has to disassemble it into conceptually related subsets of pieces. And so I began at the stanzas depicted here on screen, with the central stanza located at the latitude of 22 and the longitude of 22. We can interpret these stanzas via several different interpretive paradigms, but I would argue before we select a paradigm to apply to the stanzas and its related stanzas, we must determine the limits of that relation. That is, if we're going to curate a subset of Sea and Spar Between stanzas to make interpretation more feasible, we have to set an upper limit on the number of stanzas to include within a subset. Otherwise, the entire point of having a subset is defeated. And unless we set the upper limit to be 1, we're going to need some kind of algorithm to group interrelated stanzas together. The difficulty with formulating some such partitioning algorithm and applying it to Sea and Spar Between is that the poem's language varies at a very gradual pace, which makes identifying points at which to non-arbitrarily separate groups of stanzas very difficult. To visually illustrate this point, I diagrammed the stanzas that you can see on the screen as circles, with each stanza's words extending outwards from its respective circle's circumference. And then I repeated this process with one crucial adjustment. If a word had already been diagrammed, then it was ignored. As a consequence, only 3 stanzas out of the original 20 end up having their constituent words displayed. So once the reader has read 15% of the stanzas in the original 20 stanzas, they will have encountered every word in that subset, and the remaining 85% of text will consist solely of permutations of those words. We can see then that the stanzas here have a high degree of linguistic similarity, and the task of partitioning them into subsets is made all the more difficult because there isn't a natural juncture at which to divide them. In my thesis, I reiterated this point with another set of stanzas and with a slightly different form of exposition. This set of stanzas form a rectangle with 100 stanzas located within its vertices. And I computed the similarity between different stanzas by placing them in a term vector model. And what I mean by that is simply we can create a two-dimensional array in which the columns represent all of the unique words that appear within the 100 stanzas, and the rows represent individual stanzas. And then we fill each cell by seeing if, for example, the first unique word appears in the first stanza, and if it doesn't, we place a 0, and if it does, we record how many times it appears in that stanza. And if we repeat that process for every stanza, we'll end up with a matrix like this. And then we can represent each stanza as a vector in n-dimensional space. It's difficult to visualize that sense bar between because the number of dimensions is so high. And so I've made this kind of toy example where we have two texts that are limited to 2 words. Text 1 uses the word dog twice and the word cat twice, and text 2 uses the word dog 10 times, the word cat 8 times. And we can represent these texts in vector space by assigning each term a separate axis and by letting the frequency of each term equal the corresponding coordinate value. So for example, if we say that the x-axis represents the word cat and the y-axis represents the word dog, then text 1 will be located at 2, 2, and text 2 will be located at 8, 10, which we can see here. Here's text 1 at 2, 2, and here's text 2 at 8, 10. Once texts are represented in vector space, we can calculate their linguistic similarity by the cosine of the angle that their vectors form. As the cosine of the angle between 2 vectors approaches 1, the 2 texts that the vectors represent will be more similar. We can imagine here that if there were 2 texts that were exactly the same, they would have exactly the same vector, and therefore they would be superimposed on top of each other, and there would be they wouldn't form an angle because they would be identical, and that indicates that they're identical. And as the cosine approaches 0, the texts that the vectors represent will be less similar. Here we have an acute angle, which is intuitive insofar as the texts are composed of exactly the same words and only differ with respect to how frequently those words appear. And so they'll have a cosine similarity approaching 1. In my thesis, I took the 100 stanzas located within the stanza rectangle and wrote a program to compute each stanza's cosine similarity with every other stanza within the stanza rectangle. And I exported that to a spreadsheet, which you can see here, where the red cells indicate 2 stanzas that have a cosine similarity greater than or equal to 0.7. There are 10,000 ordered pairs of stanzas within the stanza rectangle, by which I mean that if we wanted to read a stanza in relation to another stanza, we could start with the first stanza and read it in relation to itself, and then we could move on to reading the first stanza in relation to the second stanza, and then to the third stanza, and so on until we got to the 100th stanza, and we could repeat that process for every stanza, giving us 100 times 100, or 10,000 ordered pairs. In this spreadsheet, there are 1,523 cells with a cosine similarity between 0.7 and 0.99, which means that there are 15.23% of the stanzas of the 10,000 ordered pairs, have a high degree of linguistic similarity. So what interpretive purchase does this data give us? It re-emphasizes that even relatively distant stanzas within the poem's stanza grid are similar. And these similarities complicate attempts to sculpt the poem into discrete sections because they show that there's a low correlation between Euclidean distance and linguistic distance. In the context of my thesis, I used the diagrams and the cosine similarities that we've just seen as part of a broader argument about the necessity of reading C and SPA between through the lens of the classical fragment and fragmentation more generally. And as part of that argument, I proposed a number of different modes of reading C and SPA between. And a couple of those modes were either computational or computationally adjacent. And I'll briefly discuss those before I move on to the conclusion of my thesis. So one of the things that struck me while reading the secondary literature on C and SPA between was that many critics had commented upon the fascinating decision that Montfort and Strickland had made in assigning each stanza a unique coordinate. But few people had gone on to think about the interesting possibilities that these coordinates open up in terms of structuring one's reading through the poem. For example, if we let each latitude represent an X value and each longitude value represent a Y value, then we can map every stanza in the poem onto a Cartesian plane, which is what you see here, where the green dots represent individual stanzas. And then we can take a function, so an equation for which any X input yields exactly one Y output, or Y equals f of X, and then we can plot that function onto the same Cartesian plane. The sine function was an obvious choice for me because its wave-like shape is thematically congruent with the poem's location in a virtual C. So here you see the sine wave flowing through the grid of the poem. And then we can structure our reading of the text in accordance with the wave-like shape of the sine function. We can follow the wave from crest to trough and vice versa along the x-axis and note the points at which the wave intersects the poem. So here, for example, the stanza with a latitude of 0 and longitude of 0 intersects the wave. And here the stanza with a latitude of 8 and longitude of 1 also intersects the wave. So we can choose to read only those stanzas that intersect the wave, and thereby structure our reading through the poem, which is I've here graphed what the beginning of that journey might look like. Another mode of reading I proposed was inspired by a comment written by Montfort and Strickland in the source code to C and SPA between. They wrote, "If someone were to replace our words and phrases with new texts, a generator with a similar appearance and similar functioning, but with a new vocabulary would be defined. That is, it is practically possible to create a new generator, a remix or appropriation of this one by replacing only the data in this section. If this is done and the code is not otherwise modified, the system will assemble language in the same way, but it will work on different language." And here they're inviting their readers to use the source code to C and SPA between as a kind of computational poetic template, by which I mean that if one extracts the original language from Emily Dickinson and Herman Melville, and inserts one's own language into the source code's arrays, but retains the other pieces of the source code, then the resulting text will be formally indistinguishable from C and SPA between, but radically different at the level of content. So I wrote a short Python script that first of all, I took the critical literature on C and SPA between, which came to about 20,000 words, and I wrote a short Python script that tallied the frequency of those words in that document excluding what are known in linguistics as stop words, which are common English words like the or and so on. And then I took the most frequent words in the critical literature on the poem and I inserted it into the arrays and hosted the resulting metacritical text on a website, which, as you can see, looks indistinguishable from the poem, but has quite different language. And it's my hypothesis, which might better be described as wishful thinking, that due to some serendipitous combination of words and insights from the hive mind of the criticism that the poem has inspired, there'll be a stanza within the 225 trillion stanzas here that might lead the theorization of see and far between in particular and combinatoric algorithmic poetry in general in a new direction, but obviously the odds of finding this hypothetical stanza basically nil. I will briefly mention the conclusion to my thesis. So my conclusion was broken into 7 sections, 1 of which was written by me and 6 of which were generated by GPT-2, which is an advanced text generation AI by OpenAI that generates text samples in response to an input whose tone and style it mimics. So I trained GPT-2 on my thesis, and then I had it generate samples of my thesis prefaced with the phrase "in conclusion." And I think I have time to read one of those conclusions. In conclusion, I have outlined a new way of thinking about computational poetry. I have argued that certain literary features, particularly the openness of ambition and the implausibility of failure, distinguish contemporary poetry from earlier poetic modes. I have also suggested that previous theories of computational poetry have focused too much on problem solving and not enough on the creative role of the human programmer. I have shown that although the former emphasizes individual responsibility and ingenuity, the latter sidelines these qualities in favor of emphasis on rational, collaborative effort. I have suggested that computational poetry can use sophisticated machine learning techniques to become more autonomous and therefore deserve a full attention. And I have suggested that by virtue of its innovative exterior, computational poetry should be reserved for special occasions. And one of those special occasions is today. And that's my talk. I'm going to hand back over to Dave. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Nat. So obviously not your typical English MA, and I hope that Nat gets to talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A session. My paper is titled Diving into the Worldwide Wreck on New Zealand's digital literary history. I'm very happy to be asked about the title in the Q&A. I'm going to talk about the challenges of building a history of digital literature in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and more specifically what I'll call the periodic amnesia around the academic and popular reception of various forms of digital fiction, digital narratives in New Zealand. And my focus for the present project is roughly 1995 to 2005, so that super awkward growth spurt for the World Wide Web. You'll have to resist that knee-jerk reaction to some of the sites I will show you. Okay, so I remember the year was 2003. I was in the thick of my PhD on digital media and literary studies at the University of Canterbury. I was in a conversation with the late Howard McNaughton, who was introducing me to some other people in advance of a conference that he was hosting there at the time. As he introduced me, he said, "This guy is doing what English departments will do in the future, 10 years from now." I thought that was pretty cool at the time, especially coming from Howard, who I thought was pretty cool. I distinctly remember he was wearing a lanyard that had a USB stick attached to it. And I remember that because it was certainly the first time I had seen one of those things. It would have been even cooler, however, if it were true. As I discovered later than I'd like to admit, while I was completing my own project, the first dissertation on what was then called hypertext fiction in New Zealand was a 1995 Master of Arts in English at Massey University by John Bridges. Yes, that John Bridges, the one who went on to become a television producer, media host, actor, and comedian in this country. Bridges actually developed his own hypertext system in text, which is what you're seeing on the screen. And it was for the purpose of creating tutorials for students of literature. He included a version of in-text with a submission of his dissertation in the form of a floppy disk inside the back cover of the jacket of the dissertation. So in 2005, I submitted the second dissertation on digital fiction in New Zealand. That same year, the New Zealand Herald wrote an article on the topic. It was about how a bunch of secondary school students taking the NCAA were bamboozled by its inclusion in the level 3 English exam, as was admittedly the reporter of the article herself. And this all speaks to my broader point about periodic amnesia, with period and periodic being used in this dual sense of every now and then, but also how we go about historicizing periods and breaks in the temporal sense. So there's a nod here to Frederick Jameson and Brian McHale on doing literary history, but also I want to foreground my nod to Alan Liu's claims about the need to do history differently in the digital age. So whereas in the US and the UK, you had this clear progression of what we would call the hype of hypertext in the late 1990s that carried across academic and popular contexts. In New Zealand, digital literary artifacts such as hypertext and other forms of digital fiction would be stuck in a kind of quantum contradiction, perpetually new and old at the same time. So just on the terminology, what do I mean by digital literature or digital literary works? In the most popular sense, before 2018, people would have said, "Oh, so you mean like Choose Your Own Adventure?" And I would have said, "Yeah, but it's about a lot more than that." After 2018, people would say, "Oh, so you mean like Bandersnatch from Black Mirror?" And I would say, "Yeah, I kind of like that, but it's about so much more than that." So digital, or what's also called electronic literature, covers a growing range of things still, but the focus for me is narrative, text-driven works in digital environments, what John Cayley has called literal art or digital language art. And that primarily includes all kinds of interactive digital fictions, from early pre-web hypertext fiction, parser-based interactive fiction where you type something in and then you get a response, as well as later and often flash animation-based digital fictions online. But my broader history and what I'm trying to pull together here also includes digital poetry. It also includes networked and online performance. It also includes story-driven video games. Some examples are coming. So what you're actually looking at on the screen is a timeline that's anchoring the bigger project. It started out as just my own way to start to make sense of the material, but then I realized it's kind of its own DH project in its own way. It's made with something called Timeline JS, which just refers to JavaScript out of Knight Lab at Northwestern University. It's a product of Zach Wise and his sort of digital journalism movement there. And it's as easy as knowing how to use a Google spreadsheet. So I was quite happy to work with it. Serendipitously, in Alan Liu's latest book, he reserves the final chapter for a close reading of this platform, Timeline JS, what he calls a micro form of historical distant reading. So for the rest of the session, I want to briefly run through some of the factors that contribute to the challenges of historicizing this material. I'll look at 3 quick examples of early digital literary works in or of New Zealand. Some of the people making these things had already moved elsewhere by the time they self-published them online. And then I'm going to conclude with a musing on this curious commonality that I found between 2 of the first works I looked at in the form of a really similar animated GIF. So that's my close is what I'll call my riff on the GIF. So finally, this paper is as much an invitation. I won't call it a cry for help. That is, I welcome anyone who wants to help me fill in this history to please get in touch. So another anecdote then. During the first lockdown in 2020, there were a whole lot of creative appropriations of online space as creative performance spaces. And this was followed by a lot of errant claims about online firsts in this domain. A group of digital artists, including New Zealander Helen Kennedy, who coined the term cyberformance in 2000, who had been doing this stuff for decades, along with some other artists, Annie Abrams and others, put together a compilation video called Before the First, with excerpts of many actual firsts for networked and online performance. And this goes all the way back to 1992. Some of them were on New Zealand custom online performance software called Upstage that Vicky Smith, who is in the last panel, was most certainly involved with. And what you see is a 2004 example of the first New Zealand online performance event entity that was done in the Upstage environment. So in the broadest sense, the challenge that arises is peculiar to the time period in question. Technocultural amnesia is arguably endemic. Digital culture is seemingly ahistorical. We might add to that the perception that the web is also unliterary. Clearly, whatever the internet thinks, it thinks about the now. So we might even contrast that with forms of narrative, which are paradigmatically retrospective, and even on the other end, simulative forms that a lot of DHers will be familiar with. Forms of modeling are predictive and forward-looking. So we're kind of stuck when we're in this native web domain. So in Alan Liu's recent book, it's called Friending the Past, A Sense of History in the Digital Age, he concedes that the sense of the network outweighs or displaces the sense of history. But he pushes back against this ahistorical, this broader ahistorical conception, and establishes that the digital age does have a sense of history in its own measure. And what the whole book really does is pushes on these terms of sense and measure, and does an incredible job devising all these parameters for those seemingly abstract terms. Either way, the point I need to make here is that when doing digital history in the digital age, you have also these pragmatic and familiar problems with hardware and software upgrades, the dreaded obsolescence or platform problem. Add to that fact, and we talked about this in the last panel, this ever-changing terminology. So people are calling the same things by different names, and they're also trying to come up with new names for every new thing as part of a kind of foothold in the new field. Sometimes new platforms also almost create new forms or new genres by default. So something like Twitter fiction, for example. But I want to think about possible local factors that are contributing to this collective failure. And I'm pointing the finger at myself here to historicize New Zealand's digital literary history. First of all, there were no real established publishing venues, institutional or not. The one shining exception to that was Trout Journal, which ran from '97 to 2012. That was started by Brian Flaherty, Robert Sullivan, Tony Murrow, and later Helen Kennedy. I think I saw Brian in the crowd. I'll have to see when I expand my tiles during the Q&A. Another factor would have been a kind of reactionary treatment to some of the early adopters in New Zealand. And I'm talking here about particular cultural context. So one of the interviews that I conducted was with Ross Nepia Himona, regarded as the first Maori on the internet. And he's told me, and he's also discussed this elsewhere, that not everyone in his iwi was happy about the sort of stuff that he was putting online, especially when it was tied to genealogical information. And finally, I'm not a social anthropologist here, but again, perhaps anecdotally, there might be something to say for cultural humility at play here. I don't know, or cultural reticence. I'm tempted to hark back to John Bridges' MA and call it the tall floppy syndrome, but I'll resist that. I got a grin in the live audience. So arguably, the first digital fiction, New Zealand's first digital fiction in or of New Zealand, would be Alan O'Leary's 2000 work, A Thread. It's described as a short hypertext work about consequences. It tells of an encounter between strangers, a man and a woman, in which the woman pulls a single red thread that is hanging out from the man's jacket. The interface makes graceful, minimalist use of graphics in the form of a red thread image as a backdrop that tethers the text displayed. It also makes innovative use of a split screen effect, whereby some links call up text in a left-hand column that reflect the thoughts of the man, while the other links appear adjacently to the right as the thoughtscape of the woman. So you have these two things, sort of a call and response. The result is a compelling social asynchrony in which each narrate their own view of the encounter, an encounter that I think takes on added resonance 2 decades later in a post-pandemic age of social distancing. O'Leary is better known as a playwright. By the time this was published or self-published on his site, which he's admirably kept live for over 20 years now, he was in Melbourne. He's been London-based ever since. His earlier work, The Casino Project, could also be described as the first, and according to O'Leary, it's only 60% completed, so I can't really count that. Casino Project was O'Leary's response to the opening of Melbourne's new, it was actually a relocated Crown Casino on the south bank of the Yarra River in Melbourne. It's a horror story of sorts, where readers get to choose to gamble or shop, or simply park their car in the building's scary underground parking garage. And I think that's appropriate on the eve of what we could call the apotheosis of consumer capitalism. Black Friday, I believe, is tomorrow. But before I move into my final movement on the animation, I do need you to note in the lower left-hand corner, there's that little running man. So I've got one more work to look at, and then I'll wrap up. 1996 reflections on running could be described, albeit in a really roundabout way, as among New Zealand's earliest digital poems. Its author, as I mentioned, is regarded as the first Maori on the internet, and also often described as the soldier poet. Major Ross Nepia Himona served in the New Zealand military for over 2 decades. And in the mid-90s, he created some of the first websites and domains where Maori culture was shared by Maori and for Maori. He was a founding member of the Maori Internet Society, and he was doing essays and commentary along with his poetry. Reflections on Running was self-published in '96 on the web. It's much earlier than that, actually, but on the web, it was given these flax-like borders and the animated GIF of the running Maori warrior added to the original text that you see on the screen. So it was written first in the early 1980s, published in '86 in a collection called Heroes and Sparrows, a celebration of running that was edited by Roger Robinson, who was himself a celebrated runner, but also a professor of English at Victoria University, Wellington. It's been published, republished many times, many countries, and it also features in the New Zealand Electronic Poetry Centre. But it only appears with that running animated GIF on Himona's self-published sites, Maori.com and MaoriNews.com. So I found it curious that among the first works of digital fiction and poetry in New Zealand, there was this commonality, this runner that I found suspended in space but striding infinitely in time. Graphics interchange format or GIF. I have put a link on Himona's entry on the debate between the pronunciation of GIF or GIF, so you can follow that up, or we could spend the whole Q&A on it. That's up to you. So this was one of the first image formats commonly used on websites. And even though it was initially released in '87, the revelation came in '95 when Netscape Navigator introduced the ability for an animated GIF to loop. This turned the GIF into a symbol for the reuse and recycle ethic of the web, especially since it allowed web developers to do what was then considered some fairly magical special effects in an extremely cost-effective way. So I like to think there might be some extra resonance here in a digital literary sense. After all, the symbol is almost always seen in these early texts running from left to right. Perhaps a comment on the inherent textuality or legibility of the web in terms of how we read it, in terms of how it's built from text, and at least as text is set up in paradigmatic modes of literacy in Western culture. The notion of running across the screen evokes traversal across media in a generative and generational sense. It evokes the elation of a new form of movement from the aesthetic to the infrastructural. We are running our programs, at least that is until they crash. As Paul Virilio reminds us, every new technology brings with it some new form of accident. In the case of O'Leary and Himona, of course, one runner is running away, whereas the other is running toward. That is, one embodies anxiety and paranoia, the other transcendence. So ultimately, this image, this reflection on running, might serve as a meta comment on the paradoxical attraction and repulsion of the World Wide Web. To borrow a phrase from the last panel, the blurring or the confusion between the sacred and the profane. And I think this is true for those who had a sense of what the web could become and what it would become. The same attraction and repulsion is something that I at least still feel every single day. Thanks for listening, and we're happy at this point to take questions. First question is for April. Okay, so I'll ask it, April, and you're still ready to go. Do you consider the disruptions to the narrative you describe in games like Hellblade and so on, or do they operate in a way similar to the disruption Wolfgang Iser describes in relation to linear narrative? So here we have a kind of, again, a cross-medial comparison in terms of the way that we're disrupted as readers, willfully disrupted in reading narratives. Tell us a bit more about the kind of disruptions, the encounters as we discussed them in your dissertation that are happening in terms of comparison or category.
Right. Yeah. So I saw that comment come in. So I did a quick kind of refresh on that, and because the name sounded familiar. The short answer would be yes, that could work. The long answer is the disruption. The whole point, or how I got around to that, was coming from, I came from a post-colonial lit background for my master's, and was drawing from work like Gayatri Spivak and Edward Said, and drawing on the work of Emmanuel Levinas, and how people have talked about using the idea of the saying interrupting the said, and I've been trying to do this quickly, but the interruption that a lot of post-colonial theorists talk about when we're reading a text that is representing the post-colonial other, and how that can work. So Gayatri Spivak talks about silence and the potential for silence to kind of disrupt a text in that way. So in that sense, that's kind of what I was thinking about with your comment about Isers, because I believe you're referring to like kind of gaps in text or breaks in text or something like that. That would definitely kind of line up with where I was coming from in terms of disruptions in the games that I was looking at. But that's where that all kind of came from, to give you a very brief theory background of what was driving a lot of my dissertation and the theory behind it.
Yeah, there's a lot of narrative theory, there's a lot of literary theory theorizing the gap in print literature. So I'm sure that we could go about theorizing the gap in gameplay, but it would be, sort of different in an experiential sense. So that's a fascinating question. Thank you. Any other questions? Is anyone disturbed by Nat's hybrid intelligence in terms of computationalizing poetry? Any other thoughts? Anyone who wants to help me with my history? I acknowledge Paul Miller's footnote that Robinson is still running, I believe, with double knee replacement. But so it's obviously doing quite well. Let me then go ahead and turn to Nat, not turn on Nat, but I will turn to Nat and ask him. So one of the things I found compelling is the way that you sort of turn the methods of those readers back onto them. It's sort of an attempt to read the unreadable. But one of the things you noted was the sense in which you were forced back. You had this almost infinitely expanding computational text, but you were forced back into the local. You were forced back into a local context. And do you find that experience happening in other things that you're looking at and other things that you're working on? Is that you get forced back into a close reading instead of a distant reading, is another way to put it.
Right.
Is it the close reader in you? Does it come out every now and then?
Right. Well, yeah, I think that I've probably been indoctrinated by the new critics, and in a sense, in my perhaps privileging of close reading as a as the preeminent method of retrieving meaning from a text.
So is some of your work, do you think, a conscious or non-conscious attempt to get away from that?
And moving towards computer science.
Yeah. Or just trying to find the hybrid balance or synergy between the two?
Yeah, I'm definitely fascinated by Moretti's work at Stanford on the possibility of using computers to interpret just corpora that humans simply don't have the time to read and pass.
Yeah.
So I think that probably the future for digital literary interpretation will be some kind of combination of distant and close reading.
And the reading the term reading, everyone seems kind of okay with that humans can read and machines can read. But your phrase hybrid intelligence, do you some thinkers like Catherine Hales have gone over and said, yep, machines can be or have intelligence. Has that been a sticking word for you at all, or are you just kind of okay with it?
I'm probably not familiar enough with kind of theories of posthumanism or cognitive assemblages to really think deeply about what it would mean for a machine to read.
That's fair enough. Does anyone else want to jump from that idea or another idea? I will go back to there's another question. I just need to ferret it out. This is from Brian, Kyoto Brian. I'm really glad you could join us. I'm curious about digital archaeology in this space. What has been lost and what still retains traces in stores like New Zealand National Library and Internet Archive. Thanks for that. I've actually had some success tracking down early works from the late 90s from trout that have been held in the National Library. There are at least bibliographical entries for them, which I found encouraging, and I've been using the Wayback Machine and trying to figure out how to test the very limits of the Wayback Machine. But if perhaps you would be willing to say a bit more about this, if your mic ready and willing. One of the slides on this timeline is from the New Zealand, on the timeline I was showing you before, is from the New Zealand Electronic Poetry Centre, and it has a whole bunch of tiles from really well-known New Zealand poets with broken flash links. And that's the entry I've called Flash in a Pen, and it talks about the way in which we are actually losing, in danger of losing works that are a lot more recent than some of those 90s works that I've shown. And a lot of those are your works. And in my fourth year Story Worlds in Cognition class, we had a class project where they were assigned New Zealand digital artists and writers, and they were tasked with doing a recording of whatever was left, so that at least there would be a few minutes of some of these works before they go. White Scarves, I think, is still playable because that's not a flash. Well, you could probably just tell me if I've got that right, but it is still working. But over to you. Tell me a little bit more about that and the flash issue, we'll call it.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting that kia ora, everyone. Just the ideas around the flash era and what's to become of it. So I'm kind of in two minds about my poetry, my flash poetry. That some of it was done with early action Flash action script, and it'll be quite hard. Or the tools for migrating don't seem to work with that early action script. I'm in two minds about it, really. Part of me thinks I'd like to try and recover or transfer it into a new medium. Another part of me kind of thinks, well, maybe it's a bit like graffiti art, really. It has its time and then it disappears, and maybe that's a good thing, I mean, just
Yeah, well, the only thing I will say back to that is that in the States, they took a much they chose option number one, and it can't be done on an individual basis where the authors go back and do all of that work themselves without support, without funding, without infrastructure. So at Victoria, University of Victoria in Canada, there's a project called Pathfinders, where they have the authors read from their own works, and these videos are recorded. So they've done, I think, half a dozen authors like that. So if we were so inclined, well, I think we are inclined, but if we could find the right support, I don't think there's any reason not to do that here, because otherwise, I think it will be lost. And yeah, I'm not so sure it should be thought of as graffiti, but I think its ephemerality is one of its compelling and intriguing qualities. But I think it's part of literary history, and I think I don't think the web can be. Sometimes I wish it were just one big graffiti and it would fade away. But I think we have a responsibility to save what is worth saving and has cultural currency and is worth discussing for future generations. But yeah, we'll see. Thank you, though, Brian. Other thoughts? Well, I have at least one more question, then I'll go to April, because I thought the pivot in your paper about when and how and why we would want to teach some of these works that don't present themselves as or wrap themselves as pedagogical or educational. So in Hellblade, of course, it presents itself as in this fantasy realm. It's cueing itself in this genre. So I'm wondering if, in this sense, there's a kind of deliberate subterfuge to get people to play it. So it always has to kind of come after the fact, because if it didn't, I'm trying to look at games, for example, that are about there's an autistic protagonist, for example. If it's set in a realistic setting, maybe it doesn't have the broader initial appeal. It doesn't have that broader reach. So maybe you could speak about that a little bit.
That's a good question. So if I'm understanding correctly, there's the concern about how it might be, if it should be a concern to make a game particularly fun, even though it's supposed to be teaching something, and have it be exciting and correct? You're just like, how much should we put into an effort of making it engaging? Yeah, I think, well, I mean, I think that you could say that for just about all media. I mean, it is difficult. You think about like novels, and some of the novels we read in school, some of them are not particularly engaging for students, but we still encourage the reading of. So I guess I'm of the mind of if there's a game out there that might not necessarily lend to a wide audience initially, doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't have value and couldn't be brought into and brought into more of that kind of formal learning environment and used in that way. But I think it goes either way. I think that it can be both, but there's always that risk. And then, like you said, it could end up causing problems like in terms of Hellblade, where it gets confused just in its own vacuum of, well, this is just a fun game about the Viking underworld. So yeah, I can see how that can be problematic.
And David Green has asked another question on top of that question, which takes us into Freudian realms of repetition. And I won't be one to indulge psychoanalytic experiences of repetition, but yes, you're always going back to it in a different way. But even it's almost the sense, this kind of benign manipulation of this isn't about what I think it's about, and I like April's response too, because novels do that, experimentalist novels do that to us all of the time. And yeah, and of course, to speak to David's point, there's also it's, you know, the fact that our minds get messed with as we're playing it, and I've come to realize that going back to the literary games group panel, they purposely don't define what a literary game is, even though some of the people probably listening to that panel wanted them to. But it's kind of like an ongoing project. But if they were to define it, one of the characteristics would be games that purposefully mess with your mind, right? They really like that. That's the clean version of how to describe that. But on top of that, you know, while you're playing or while you're reading, you know, in David and Bridie's and Finn's panel, the experience of going back to a work at a different time, at a different stage in your life is obviously going to change things. So we come at this with, you know, something like Hellblade with some of the context. You know, I picked it up and started looking at it, knowing that a neuroscientist had consulted on it. So there's that apparatus that's inescapable. Yeah, so maybe a benign manipulation or something along those lines, perhaps. But yeah, thank you, April. Is anybody else needing to get a question or a comment into this? I think this is the last session. Yeah, there's a plenary that starts at 6 o'clock. So why don't we consider wrapping up 5 minutes early? The last thing that I need to do now then is, however you wish to do it, with muted applause or virtual clapping, or just whatever kind of meditative gratitude. Yeah, thank you for all of those hands. Thank Nat and April and me, and we will see you at 6 p.m. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for coming along. Thanks again to the tech crew. You guys are awesome, and kia ora, everyone.